Whether you're working with rough lumber or fully dimensioned lumber that you just want to make thinner, nothing's going to beat a benchtop planer. They work well and they're a much more affordable option versus a 15-inch dedicated planer. Let's take a look at each of the Cutterheads and the kind of a performance you can expect to get from each. This planer uses a traditional Cutterhead where it has resharpenable knives that rest on screws, and then you have to set them with a tool. So they're not indexing, you have to do everything manually. So let me show you how that works. This planer does not have a dedicated dust port, but instead it has a chip deflection shield. So the first thing I need to do is to remove that by removing these wing nuts. Remove these washers. Let's put all this off to the side so we don't lose it. So now this Cutterhead, it's a 2-knife head, so it has 2 straight knives that are resting on screws in there, and they're held tight in the Cutterhead by this gib plate. So each of these screws then have to be loosened because it's just holding itself in that channel by friction. So the first thing I have to do is loosen all of these screws. I can remove the knife. And I can remove the gib plate. These springs, there's 2 of them, rest down in holes that are drilled into the bottom of the channel in this Cutterhead, and the knife rests on those springs, and as you push down on them, that adds the resistance as you set the right cutter height using the tool that we'll use here in a few minutes. Now that you have your knife out, you can see if it's got a double edge, as in this case, you can flip this one around and install it and go back and work. Or if they're both dull now, you can resharpen both edges. If it's a single edged knife, then you're going to obviously have to sharpen that each time you remove it. Okay, so now with our knife sharpened, I first got to put the gib plate in. So just drop that in place there in that channel. Make sure it's aligned with the ends of the Cutterhead. And now drop your knife in. You always want the beveled edge pointing back toward the rear here because that Cutterhead spins in this direction, so you want it to be going and cutting in that direction. So we'll put our knife between the gib and the Cutterhead channel, and it rests right down in there on those springs. And now to set that knife height, we use this tool that's a bridge tool that rests, it sets on the Cutterhead on each side of the channel. And I want to make sure the legs are touching the Cutterhead, and then I want to push down on the bar. And now I want to tighten the gib screws. So I want to start in the middle. And I just want that snug at first. I don't want to tighten it yet. So then I move to the next one. Just snug again. Now I move down to the next one back this side. So I'm kind of going to work from the center outwards, alternating sides. Okay, now that I've got them snug, I can remove the setting tool. And now I want to go back to the center and avoid touching the knife. Don't cut yourself. And you want to just tighten those up good. And now we're done. So that knife is ready to go. Now that I've got this machine back together, let me show you what kind of cut you can expect from this type of Cutterhead. Notice how the straight knives left more pronounced scallop marks across the width of the board. This style of planer uses disposable straight knives. Now this model is a little bit different than some of the lunchbox style, but the Cutterhead and the application inside for changing them is the same throughout. So let me show you how to do that. Okay, the first thing I have to do is to remove these tall screws. They hold the dust collection chute in place over the cutter head. And now I can remove the dust collection chute. And there's our cutter head. So there's a cutter head lock here that holds that in place. So just push down on that to rotate the cutter head to where you've got the gib plate and the gib screws showing, so that I can remove now. I've got to remove all these 8 screws from the gib plate. So let's go along and loosen each one. Okay, now I can lift that gib plate out, and this tool, and most of these have a magnet on there. This has 2 magnets, so all I have to do is touch that to the gib plate. So now I can use the magnets to lift the gib plate up. Let's get that out of the way. And this is our knife. So just use the magnet again, and that lifts it up out of there. These disposable knives have 2 cutting edges so that you can flip it around and use the other edge when the one is dull. And these slots are the registration slots for the pins. On the cutter head, there's 2 pins, so that when you put that in there, you put your knife right over those pins, and that registers it from front to back this way. And then it's got just a little bit, because it's a slot, it has just a little bit of movement side to side. So you can get those lined up. Ultimately, you need the holes to line up where the screws will go back in place. Okay, with our knife in place on the cutter head, registered on the pins, we want to bring the gib plate back in. Line that up with the bolt holes. And then let's put them in, starting with the center. Just get in there. Don't snug it up yet, just get it close, but don't snug it up until you've got them all in. Okay, now with them all in place, go back to the center and tighten it down. Again, alternating sides, just keep working your way outward. And there we are, ready to cut again. So now let's put it back together. Now let me run a board through it to show you how this machine cuts. Because this planer had 2 feed speeds, we ran it at the slower one, which allowed more cuts per inch, and that results in fewer scallop marks across the width of the board. So you get a much cleaner cut. This planer has one of the more basic insert cutter heads. Let's take a look at it. Okay, this cutter head has the insert cutters with 4 cutting edges, and each one is mounted by its own screw. So with these, they're staggered across the cutter head so that whatever this one overlaps the previous one, and then the next one overlaps, so that across the width of the whole cutter head, each row overlaps the previous row, so you get a cleaner cut that way. If you should get a dull cutter or a nicked cutter, you only have to replace the ones that are affected. So if you get a nick in one, you can loosen this and turn it to a new sharp edge and tighten it back up without having to change all of them. Let's show you how to do this. I don't have to take the screw all the way out. I can just rotate it to a new edge and now tighten the screw back up. If I want to remove it, then I go ahead and remove the screw altogether, and then I can put a new cutter on it. With the cutter removed, you can see the 2 sharp cutting edges here. On the other sides are just squared off. So when those 2 are dull, then you have to replace it. On this cutter head, the cutters are all in line and perpendicular to the way the board is fed through. So the cutting edge here is perpendicular to that board edge. Others will be a little bit different. Let's run a board through this and see how it looks. The insert cutter head on this machine left subtle ridges and valleys along the length of the board. This machine has a more advanced insert cutter head. The cutters are mounted in a spiral design around the cutter head. Okay, this model has a bird Helical cutter head, and that has the cutters mounted, as we can see, spiraled around the cutter head here. It has 4 cutting edges all the way around on the cutters. They're all made of carbide. Same concept though as before. You can turn as many as you want, so you can loosen one, spin it to a sharp edge, work your way around, or you can replace them all. Same thing, just loosen the screw, twist the cutter head, or replace it completely. Because this cutter head doesn't have a lock, changing out the knives there and holding onto it can be kind of dangerous. So recommend wearing a glove with your holding hand so that you can hold these cutters and then turn or loosen one and not cut your fingers as you're rotating the cutter head around. Now let's run a board through it and look at the quality of the cut. The spiral insert cutter head left more pronounced valleys and ridges along the length of the board. No matter which benchtop thickness planer you choose from the models on the market, you can count on any of them to thickness material accurately, to have enough power to handle the load, and to keep your shop clean from all the chips and debris. The biggest thing is to get the cut quality that you're wanting out of it, because the better the cut quality, the less time you'll spend sanding, and then you can finish your project and move on to the next one.